I love your plethora of books. I have like my one book right here.
What's the book? Let me see. What was the book?
It's Hope is the Thing with Feathers, poems of Emily Dickinson.
Emily Dickinson. That's great.
This is my one
She's
book of
great.
poetry. It was sent
Oh.
to me promotionally. So hey everyone, this is David Stark from Watcher Pass. Today I'm joined by William Nunez, the writer and director of The Laureate, which is coming to theaters, digital, and on demand on January 21st, 2022. We're going to talk to him in just a second, but first let's check out the trailer. And while you're watching, if you can like and subscribe to this channel, that would be fantastic. I'll spend a lot. Thank you. So thanks so much for joining me. This is William Nunez, the writer and director of The Laureate, which is coming to theaters, digital, and on demand on January 21st, 2022. It is a fascinating story. My first question is, how is this a true story? Because I was watching it and I was like, how is this possible?
Can you imagine? I know. A few people have asked me, you've done this story that's crazy, that it's so shocking that it even happened back in the 1920s. And I always reply, well, it would be shocking even now. You
Yeah.
know, I mean, it did happen. I think a few people have asked me in some Q&As in Europe, where I was in the latter part of last year, like, if those things really happen. And I go, I did. I'd love to say I did creative licensing on these things, but that's what made the story so rich. And I could have done a movie about the whole writing Graves relationship, which actually spanned about 12 years.
Mm-hmm.
But I thought it would be a little bit too polemic and too repetitive of Laura Writing's character, if that makes sense. So I decided to then hone it down to the first 2 years of their relationship before they moved to Spain. And he wrote his seminal book, Goodbye to All That.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people probably do what I did, and it sounds like a lot of the people you talked to have done. Like, as soon as the movie was over, because I don't think it might have said like one or two things about Graves, but it didn't really go into a ton of it. I like Google. I was like, I have to find out, like, what is this? Is this a true story? Like, how much of this is true? And you're just like reading through, like, yeah, well, everything seems to line up. That is insane.
Yeah, it is. And just in keeping to what you were saying, when we did the world premiere at the Mallorca Film Festival, which I selected that festival just because that's where Graves and Writing moved to.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought it would be pretty cool to debut the movie there. A British veteran walked up to me and said, I knew nothing about Graves, but I came from Afghanistan and I suffer from PTSD and I was having these nightmares and things. And my wife let me bring on a girlfriend and almost had the same sort of situation. And of course, the consequences were very kind of similar to what happened to Goodbye to All That. And he goes, I think I'm going to go read his poetry now or read his book. And I thanked him, and I thanked him for serving in Afghanistan as well. But I was like, yeah. And I think at the end of the day, if I won, the mission of the movie has been accomplished if somebody takes that reaction, has that reaction to it.
Yeah, definitely. And I think going kind of to that point, like what was kind of I loved and kind of crazed about in this movie was at the end, you see that last scene where spoilers, sorry, I'm gonna jump right into spoilers right now. You see that last scene where you kind of have the battle lines drawn in this family, and it's just like he became great, but kind of at what cost? And I kind of loved that scene. I kind of loved the overall message of like, how much would you almost sacrifice, or what would it take to kind of raise yourself up to that level, and is it worth it? And is it worth that cost? It's kind of the underlying message of this movie.
And I think, David, you hit upon the theme of the movie. I think a lot of people are going to try and take different things of it, but what the story appealed to me is, unlike when I was first having my conversations with Tom Hughes, is that, because he was he is a big Beatles fan. I said, well, the story of John Lennon is very similar, where he was a famous member of a world famous rock group and a songwriter of great repute, and he was married with a child and living happily. And then he met this woman who was kind of foreign to everybody, right? And divisive, and had her opinions and all that. And he became a different artist. Mm-hmm. So that is what I kind of want to just give a snapshot to, that this happens kind of to every artist, I think, is the power of the muse and the muse's relationship to the other people around his or her life, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, definitely. And you know, Yoko and Laura were such strong, like you said, like strong figures that were able to kind of
Yes.
bring it out of them, but then also alienate by, you know, either by choice or just kind of by the force of their will, all those around
Yes.
them.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, you know, the thing is, like John Lennon, Robert Graves became a different writer. So he was mainly known as a war poet. And I think with Laura Writing's influence and help, he ended up becoming a novelist and did Claudius the God. And his poetry then shifted more towards love poetry. And he continued on that vein even after they broke up, which is, let me tell you, if you think this story was crazy, that's a movie in itself. The way they broke up in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, actually, in the United States, funnily enough, that's just as crazy. And I had that originally in my film, but that's where I was saying before that maybe it's just a little bit too much. So I decided to concentrate on him breaking from England. And, you know, like most veterans and most people who come back from war and feeling the effects of PTSD is like, what, you know, I fought for my country, but what is my country giving back to me? Now that can be a mental block, but at the end of the day, they're feeling some tug and pull because they can't, you know, I think a lot of people have been in the front, no matter what war it is, it's easy, you know, because there's battle lines, right? And there's good versus evil or black and white or whatever you want to say. But when you come back to a domesticated situation, you now have to deal with family problems, friendship problems, and all those things. And that's kind of what, you know, and I had mates, you know, here in the States that served in the 2000s. And that's how I equated Robert's journey to this, or I tried to anyway in this.
Yeah, and definitely, and you know, also this is kind of a more modern story, but even back in the time, I imagine it was even less kind of talked about. You know, if you're having those kinds of issues, you're the strong man, you're the soldier, like you just kind of deal with it and don't discuss it with anyone, and that probably made it all the tougher to deal with because you're expected to kind of, and you showed this in the film, you're expected to kind of be a proper, you know, British person when you've got these dark feelings and these horrible memories kind of inside you that you can't really express.
Correct. And I think that is something that was never talked about, no matter where in the world, until maybe 40 years ago. And, you know, Robert lived with this kind of for the rest of his life and his entire life. And though, as I said, he became another type of writer and poet, it never really went away. And the irony of it all is even though he said goodbye to all that and he moved to Spain where he lived the rest of his life, I mean, he would go back to England and he toured the States for a book tour, etc. You know, he was still very British to its core, which is another fascinating thing. It's that they don't it's like Americans, I guess, wherever we go, we still feel, or however we feel about the country or whatever, we have that kind of patriotic sense of duty, I guess. And he always even had that until the end.
Yes, Americans, to the ire of everyone else in the world, we still have that.
Correct.
that,
Correct. You know, it was funny. I was watching the movie Chaplin early in the morning. It was on cable, you know, with Robert Downey Jr. And there was a scene with him and Kevin Kline where Chaplin, as the Brit, going, you know, America's a good country, is a good country underneath. And he goes, and then Kevin Kline goes, no, it's a good country on top. It's the underneath part, you know, and things like that.
Yeah.
So it is, and I'm sure the Brits think of it the same way, having spent some time there. You know?
Yeah, and that was also something that was interesting about this film, is kind of there's just the chaotic contrast when you have Laura Writing entering this society and just kind of how different she was, and I guess how like the American ideal and the American kind of mindset was from the proper British society mindset. I thought that was a really interesting kind of push and pull, you know, when she entered the fray.
Yeah, exactly. And it was to Robert's devotion. I don't know if it comes across as well as I intended to in the movie, but the fact that they moved to Hammersmith, London, which now, if you go to London, Hammersmith is just two stops away. But back in the 20s, you may as well have been on the other side of the planet, whereas in Mayfair and those proper Downing Street parliamentary clubhouses where Robert usually attended to, and he was part of that literary society, he chose to go, to the fringes. And that's kind of my Ed Wood type part of the movie, where another, reference I took from was, I remember watching Ed Wood and being struck by the fact that there they are doing their best, even though they're making terrible films, but they don't think they're making terrible films, right? And those kind of bohemian artists are doing whatever. But, of course, they're not equated in the literati or whatever as T.S. Eliot or Siegfried Sassoon and all that. But, all those people like a Jeffrey Phibbs and things like that, they followed Laura writing and they stuck to their cliques. And Robert followed that direction to a, another cost to himself for a while.
Yeah.
To his reputation.
Yeah, definitely. So I guess I love this conversation. I kind of want to go back to the very start.
Yes.
How did you hear about this story? Like, I mean, you clearly are well read, so maybe this is just something that you have been interested in. But how did you kind of hear about this insane historical story?
Well, as a kid, I would watch here in the States the I, Claudius TV series with John Hurt, Derek Jacobi, and Brian Blessed, and I thought, wow, this is amazing. And then lo and behold, I saw my mother had the books. And I spent, sixth grade summer reading both Claudius, to God, and I loved it because I already had seen the series, so I can follow along in my 11-year-old, 12-year-old mind. And then I started going to the library and I started reading his poetry and some other novels, and he ended up becoming my favorite writer. And I remember in the mid-90s reading a biography of his. And I knew nothing about Laura writing or his relationship with his wife, et cetera, et cetera. And I thought, wow, this would make an interesting movie. But I was still in film school. Mm-hmm. And I was like, I'm too young to do a movie, this kind of thing. So I'll put it aside for a bit. And I, started my career and all that stuff in my life. And then I, a few years ago, I got back into it.
When you kind of took on another person into your relationship and started that whole thing, just to kind of experience that and raise your level, right?
Yeah, I think so. Because, one of the funny things about film school is that, when you're that young and you're doing your student films, some, not all, some students do kind of, if they don't have those life experiences, just take references from other directors. But those directors have lived, right? If you're trying to do a Bergman-esque movie, well, Ingmar Bergman, by the time he was doing Wild Strawberries, has lived a life, right? So for you trying to do something because you have a loft in New York City and you have a girlfriend or a boyfriend or whatever, you're, the deeper echelons of it might not work. So I would do silly little movies that are like 2 or 3 minutes with a one-punch joke, because that's kind of what I knew. So yeah, I do agree. I hopefully had some foresight and said, let me put this aside, let me live life a little bit, because how can I talk to actors or financiers or anybody about the project if it's coming from a different place? And obviously, if I had said made this movie when I was much younger, I don't think it would have turned out different.
No, definitely. And I think that, one of the main aspects about this film that you have to be careful with is just kind of like the care in their relationship. And, that I think that kind of takes, like you said, some life experience to kind of understand some of the dynamics. Because I thought that it was very subtle, especially at the start, like how Laura started to kind of infiltrate in the relationship. And then there's some scenes where, they're all living kind of a very happy life, which I think those are probably my favorite. Well, I think the ending was my favorite scene, but I loved seeing the family kind of working in that way, and some of the just kind of like little things that Laura did to kind of winch her way in, and then also to draw them apart, I thought were very well handled. So I think, to your point, you do need a little bit more life experience to kind of get the care and kind of understanding behind all that.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I agree. I think so. I mean, the character of Nancy was going to be the anchor of the movie, because in a strange way, she would be, I think, somebody that the audience could relate to, if that makes any sense. Because I don't think you can relate to a brooding guy suffering from PTSD. And I think Laura is so over the top and ambitious and aggressive that I don't, so I think Jeffrey Phibbs, played by Fra Fee, and Nancy Nicholson, played by Laura Haddock, I think they were, to me, and I told them this, you're basically the audience, so you have to play it to like, how would an audience react to all the craziness that's going around you? And you guys are the kind of center. And like most people, they would get out of there, which is what they did.
Yeah, I think, Robert and Laura were kind of the artists. They were, like you said, it'd be tough to kind of get behind them. But then Nancy and Jeffrey, they were both artists in their own right, but they were also kind of more normal people that were thrust into this situation and then had normal, I think, reactions to it. But first they're kind of intrigued and excited, and then at some point they're like, this is not good at all.
No, it isn't. I mean, but I think that is the reaction that most people would have. In the beginning, they would think, oh, this is cool, let me hang out, let me check this out for a while, and then they would go, okay, enough's enough. And I think Jeffrey finding some normality in Nancy was interesting for him. And then he was able to let go. And I think, and it's strange, and I hope it comes across in the film that, for Laura writing, everything she does is about control. So it's not about, actual genuine feelings, if that makes sense. And that was kind of the type of personality she was. But I sense, you have two feminists coming from different sides. And I've seen that where Nancy was a strident feminist and argued for equal pay and all those things and all those issues. And from a militant point of view, Laura Riding believed in those same things, but she used her sexuality to try to advance her way, if that makes sense. That's why some men went for her and some people figured her out pretty quickly, and I always found her character very interesting. And what I find for Robert Graves is that he needed that conflict to create. He needed that. And he, even after him and Laura broke up, he continued with his muses and getting that conflict for his whole life, because that's how he now believed he could write. And he wrote a book called The White Goddess that came out in the mid-40s. That a lot of artists of that time would go to Majorca and seek him out. Peter Bogdanovich passed away. I had the good fortune of meeting him a few years ago, and he told me The White Goddess. I told him I was making a movie. I was trying to make a movie about Robert Graves and all that. And he was like, well, he was my favorite writer. And I went, well, I know, that's why he brought it up. But he was like, The White Goddess is like a Bible to me. And all those things. And Orson Welles loved Robert Graves. You'd visit him in New York and things like that. So it was an interesting kind of theory that he had. I don't know how popular it'd be today, but of course about the conflict between the sexes that you need in order to create.
Well, and I mean, I guess you can't really argue with the results, right? Like it seems to work for him. Yeah.
For him, it worked. Yeah. I mean, there's great videos on YouTube and all that with, in 1968 or 67 and with the BBC interview where he talks about it and he admits it, about he needs that conflict. Yeah.
And going back to the point about Jeffrey, I really I loved those scenes with Nancy as well, because like you said, when he's in the bigger relationship, it feels like he has to be guarded because he's kind of, like you said, Laura's all about control, so he's trying to keep his independence. But then when he finally goes and sees Nancy and just kind of hangs out, it felt like he could just kind of drop his guard, and then you got to see that smile that you only saw at the very start of the movie again, and that was kind of a fun view of him when he finally was able to kind of be himself and relax.
Well, I'm glad that Fra did that, actually. In the end, you're talking about at the barge at the end, kind of when they kind of kiss and she goes, I don't want to be. I'm glad he did that, because to be honest, I wasn't paying that much attention, because you wouldn't believe it. It was like, because we shot in January, so the light in England goes around 4:00, and we were pushing it, and it was 6:00 in the evening. And at that time, all the planes from Heathrow are flying literally overhead of our barge.
Oh, wow.
And the actors were having a hard time concentrating because it was literally every 45 to 90 seconds you'd hear another plane. It was crazy. But the magic of ADR and the magic of visual effects, it looks like it's in the afternoon.
Yeah, movie magic.
It was
Yeah.
movie magic. Yeah.
It might have felt weird if you heard planes flying overhead.
I think so. And then all of a sudden it's like pitch black.
Yeah.
You know, and in the beginning of the scene when he's tossing the little circles within the guy, it was like still light out. But by the time we got to like whatever take it was of the two of them on the bench, it was like pitch black. It was like, wow, we just literally made it through for that. That was pretty funny. But they delivered it. It was great.
Yeah, no, they did. All the performances were really great. And kind of speaking of the performances, I loved the four main characters. I to your point about how you didn't want to make it just Robert and Laura. Like, I think having all four of them made it so much more fun to see. How did you get them all involved? It sounds like maybe Tom Hughes was in a little earlier, and then maybe everyone else came along. But how did you kind of get this get their core group involved?
Yeah, I mean, this took me a few years to develop. So I had other casts. They came in, came out, financing came in, came out, whatever. Tom Hughes, funnily enough, came in to audition for Jeffrey Phibbs a few years ago. And I saw him and I said, wow, this guy looks just like Robert Graves. I mean, and we had a great chat. We got along great. But obviously I couldn't use him because it would be too bizarre that the guy looks like Robert Graves more than the actor that I had at the time attached as Robert Graves. So that would be strange. So I always kept in my mind, commitments happened. So the other guy fell out. So I just called him and I said, hey, listen, I hope you remember me. I hope you want to do this. And he said, yeah, absolutely. Let's give it a go. Dianna came to me through our agents. They put us together. We had a beautiful couple of drinks in New York. And, I didn't really think of her until it was suggested to me. But then I thought about it. I go, this could be an interesting casting choice. I know there's a great actress in her, from watching The Family and stuff like that. And and she was great. And Laura Haddock was on a list of actresses for Nancy. And I was going to meet with her. But then funnily enough, Tom and Dianna were in Italy at a wedding where Laura Haddock was. And they were talking about the movie and they were all texting me going, oh my God, I'm here with Laura Haddock and blah, blah, blah. And I go, oh my God, I'm scheduled to speak with her on Skype in a couple of days. Well, yeah, great. So actually it was all kind of, great that they came together. And then Jeffrey Fraud just auditioned and I loved his audition tape for the role. And I think he's gonna, he's in Hawkeye now, and he was in Cinderella, which unfortunately didn't get the distribution because of the pandemic. So he has great things ahead of him. I was really, taken by Frank.
Yeah, now I'm trying to picture Tom Hughes as Jeffrey. I can't. I think Fra is just, he embodies that character, this kind of like young,
yes.
Idealistic kid that's trying to kind of make it on his own and appreciates it. So then it's like, no, I don't like this at all.
No, but with auditions, agents send you out, and I don't even know if agents really ever read what the part requires for them. So they send the actors out. But to be fair, you want to see as wide a swath of people, wide range of people as possible. But the fact that he looked like Robert, it just kind of disqualified him for that role. Yeah, but I think he got the lead, so I don't think he can complain at all.
Agents, movie critics, I send out all sorts of things like, hey, I love the interview, I really didn't really look at who it is.
No, absolutely. Exactly.
And I also love that the four main characters were kind of all artists. Did you send out sometimes like care packages of like, hey, Tom, you should read these books, Dianna, you should read these books, Patricia, you should like paint something? Like, did you send out like background information, or did they do it on their own?
I did. In terms of Robert, I mean, what was fortunate is that we were delayed a couple of years in filming because Tom was committed to finishing Victoria, and he had to do like 2 seasons back to back. And it was by the grace of God that the two, that Dianna and Laura decided to hold and wait. So in the meantime, I would just have conversations with all of them bit by bit, give them, talk about the character, talk about, give them information. With Jeffrey, there wasn't a lot to go on because, for example, he kind of disappeared from the scene after this story was told. So I did find a book by an Irish writer who met him in the 50s. So I was able to give him those pages, and hopefully he was able to glean something of it. But Jeffrey Fra had the most fun because he actually can create a character out of thin air, whereas the other three are well documented. With Laura, Dianna did a lot of research on her own, which was great. What was interesting with Laura, with the character of Nancy, is that my production designer found a program from 1975, apparently the Nicholsons, because her father and her brother were artists, well known in England at the time as well. And apparently there was a retrospective at the Victoria Albert Museum. So the program had stuff on Nancy, and a lot of the things we see on the walls at World's End in the beginning are reproductions of those actual paintings. But
oh, nice.
There was also, a couple of essays written by people, who knew Jeffrey and Nancy after this incident. And they all went their way. So you got to learn a little bit about their lives, which helped the actors, because everything I researched, you got to remember, it's coming from the biography of Robert Graves. So once Nancy and Jeffrey leave the scene, then it's all about Robert Graves, and they kind of recede. They're out of the picture. So it was nice to at least get a sense of what they were doing. And, and Jeffrey really ended up raising Robert's kids, with Nancy afterwards.
And seems like maybe a better situation for all involved after that. So.
I think so. I think hopefully you would like to say everyone, wins. Even though it's the end of a marriage between Robert and Nancy, you would think they're in, at least Nancy's in a better place.
Yeah. And Robert, clearly he craved some aspect of, of his fame or of his notoriety, because he kept kind of pursuing it. So I think, it seems like both people ended up in better places. I don't know if happier places, but at least better. Yeah.
I'd like to think so. Yeah. I like to think so.
So I know we have limited time. I want to switch. I call it the lightning round. They're just very lightweight questions about the film. See how your experiences map to things that happen in the film. You can feel free not to answer any of them. I will not be offended, but I try to keep them very answerable.
Okay.
The first question is, did you have any sort of mentor during your career, someone that you kind of sought out and hoped to teach you the ropes?
Not really. I think what happened was I worked on a lot of films as location assistant scouts in movies, and I got to not learn from directors, but I got to learn how the mechanics of a set work. And then obviously my experience in television isn't much different than marshaling the troops and getting a broadcast out. So I guess you just learn by doing.
Oh, there you go. Have you ever taken someone under your wing to turn the ropes? I guess maybe in each of your jobs, maybe you kind of do that with people around you, but anyone that kind of has been a mentee for a while?
Yeah, I think so. You always have to train people, especially when I was doing television news. You train people, bring them under your wing, and hopefully they take what they see and observe. And I'd like to always give them, give him or her practical experience and get in there, because that's the only way you're going to learn. You can watch until the cows come home, but
trial by fire, pretty much.
Trial by fire, absolutely.
Have you ever relocated to try and reinvent yourself or kind of push yourself?
No, because I love New York too much. But I spend some of my time in Spain, so that's probably where I rejuvenate myself, if that makes sense. I do work as hard in Spain as I do here in New York, but somehow it just feels different, more relaxed. I don't know.
Yeah, it's just a more relaxing culture, probably.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, but it's not like I'm doing less work.
Yeah. If you could learn under anyone, who would it be?
Well, God, what would I cite? I would love to learn under Pedro Almodovar, just to see how he gets the details of production design and cinematography, and what his thought processes are in writing a script, and realizing that, and how he communicates to the actors some of his audacious visions.
There you go. That's a good one. So what would your ideal living situation be? I think from one of your answers, I think I already can guess it, but would it be a quiet apartment in the country, a raucous New York apartment, some sort of houseboat? What would your ideal living situation be?
Somewhere in the middle. So I kind of like where I live here now in New Jersey, which is not too far from New York. so I can go to the city and do the bustle and do the restaurants and do all those things and be able to have meetings, but then not having to listen to a lot of noise just 40 minutes away.
That is always the kind of like, I love that about New York, but I can't imagine living there. Like you're out at 2 a.m. and everyone's out, the lights are up. It's just like an amazing experience. But I'm trying to think, like, if I was living there, I'd be like, no, everyone go to sleep. Like, I'm tired. So.
Absolutely. And I that's what I like about this place. But since the pandemic, I think I've been to LA and London more than I've been to New York.
Oh wow.
Funnily enough. So yeah, it's very strange, especially last year. I went to LA like 7 times, and I think I was in New York like 3. I counted that because I was wondering, this is strange.
Yeah. I hope you pick up a Junior's cheesecake every time.
I do. I do. Yeah. You know what was funny, real quick? I took the train. So because during the pandemic, you're locked down. And for some reason, Silver Streak was on, like on a loop on cable. And I decided I had to go to LA for a meeting. And I decided to take the train from Chicago to LA by myself. Oh, wow. And I did that thing. Unfortunately, it's not like Silver Streak. It was a nice ride, beautiful scenery, but you're kind of stuck and there's no Wi-Fi, where I thought I could get some work done, but there was no Wi-Fi. And I was literally stuck looking out the window, which could be peaceful, but yeah.
I think that sounds, that sounds like a very romantic, fun experience. But after kind of the first hour, where you're like, okay, like I've gotten that experience. You're like, well, now I'd like to watch a movie or something.
But you couldn't. Yeah. And then I finally figured out I could just hotspot my phone to my laptop, and I was able to catch a basketball game or something. So
there you go. So next question is, have you ever written poetry?
I have, and I've been published.
Oh, wow. There you go.
Actually, yeah.
And the last question is, you said Robert Graves is your favorite writer. Is he also your favorite poet, or do you have a separate favorite poet?
He's one of them. I think there was a good one who passed away a few years ago called Thomas Lux. He was a good American poet. He taught at Sarah Lawrence in New York, and he was good. And I like Billy Collins and Paul Muldoon.
All good choices. And so the film is out on January 21st, 2022 in theaters and on demand. So you can see it in theaters if you're comfortable. If you want to stay home, you can watch it on demand. You're out promoting the film, but I imagine you have other movies on the horizon. What's next for you? Is there like the Laureate 2,
No, I would like to try and do something different before going back to Robert Graves. But I am currently working on a documentary called The Conqueror, Hollywood Fallout, which I hope to have out later this year, which is about the making of the movie The Conqueror with John Wayne and the consequences of that when they filmed near a nuclear test site. And then I'm developing a movie called Death Benefits that I hope to start production in LA later this year.
There you go. So that's exciting. Kind of keeping busy, keeping busy. But this film is The Laureate. It is fascinating. I like I said, I couldn't believe it's a true story, but it is. It is nuanced and also very dramatic. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, David. I appreciate it.
Awesome. That was William Nunez, the writer and director of The Laureate, which is coming to theaters, digital, and on demand on January 21st, 2022. It is a crazy historical drama that is actually based on a true story. If you like this interview, please like and subscribe to this channel. It helps me out a lot. Make sure all my new content goes straight to you. Thank you.